Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon on this snowy day in New York. My name is Caroline Colas. I'm the Senior Director of Health and Wellness at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. I'm delighted that you're here with us today on the Positive Psychology Hour, How to Tame Your Inner Critic with Suzette Shahmoon. She is my guest today, and I'm thrilled to be in conversation with her. We are going to be discussing the inner critic. Do you have a voice in your head that narrates your life? How often has it criticized you, telling you you aren't good enough, smart enough, or even good looking enough? Some of us have learned to manage that voice by ignoring it or filling our lives with other noise. However, in March 2020, as the world went quiet and we all stayed indoors, many were denied their usual ability, their usual distractions, and had difficulties turning off that negative voice in their heads. Today, we will join Suzette as she discusses why we have that inner critic, why it is essential actually, how it can contribute to our well-being, and how we can tame it and narrate the dialogue between the inner critic, connecting more to ourselves and to others. Suzette Shahmoon is a cognitive hypnotherapist working with children, adults in London. The main focus of her work is helping individuals to reconnect to themselves and to others. A graduate of the Certificate in Positive Psychology program offered by the Whole Being Institute, she is now pursuing a PhD in neuropsychology at UCL, right? Yes, where she is researching well-being in people with chronic neurological illness. Welcome to the call, Suzette. You're going to have to unmute yourself. I'm going to spotlight you as well as myself. And hi, it's 5 o'clock in London.
It
or in
is.
England.
And I am virtually in New York. It's the closest I was going to get. Last year, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for joining me. First, I just was so curious about how you came across positive psychology in general and the Whole Being Institute. Can you let us know about that?
Good question. I think I was introduced to the field of positive psychology about 10 years ago 11 years ago now, when I trained as a cognitive hypnotherapist. Trevor Sylvester, who trained me, was fascinated by the field, brought a lot of it into our training. And that was it. I was taken by the subject. The following year, I went and did a course at Birkbeck University. And then I started training I did my master's in psychology, and I started looking for a course, and Whole Being came up on Google. And I loved it. Compared to everyone else, I just loved what they offered. And
Yeah.
I was right.
Yeah. I recently graduated from the Certificate in Positive Psychology program with the Whole Being Institute, and I can attest and really strongly encourage anybody to sign up. The new cohort is happening right now, and it's not too late to sign up, because it was really a remarkable. I mean, I had done a lot of work, and I'm sure you had too, and but the science behind positive psychology is really remarkable, and the focus on what is strong versus what is wrong is just a dynamic way of shifting. And I imagine that it really does partner well with managing the inner critic.
It does indeed. It's always about finding balance between those two worlds, what you know, what you do know, what you don't, who you are, who you're not. That's absolutely where I'm going to be taking you today.
Okay, fantastic. But before we start, can you tell everybody, and myself included, what is a cognitive hypnotherapist?
Very good question. So cognitive hypnotherapy is, we come from the belief system that we create our own reality, and that everything that we do is based on the patterns of behavior that we run are based on past experience. And when we are running negative patterns of behavior, things which don't serve us in life, we call that trance. So you are in an altered state of consciousness when you're doing something you don't want to do. So if you are smoking, if you are drinking, if you are overeating, if you are not eating enough, for us, that is a trance state. And so we look for ways to dehypnotize people out of those trance states. So it's a slightly different to clinical hypnotherapy.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you for that explanation. So I know we thought what we would do today, everyone, is just have Suzette kind of give us a context and a framework for the inner critic, and then we would have a dialogue about it. Does that sound like a good way to proceed, Suzette?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I'm going to take myself off spotlight and let you go ahead, and then I'll focus on the chat, and then I'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about what you have presented.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today. It's a really strange experience for me speaking on Zoom, because normally when I speak, it's to a live audience. And when you speak to a live audience, there's an exchange of energy that happens. Presenting is a type of conversation. It's just with a larger audience than one or two people. But essentially what we look for is the same feedback that we'd be looking for if we were speaking to just one or two people. We look for facial expressions. You know, how are people responding to what I'm saying? Are people shaking their heads? Are they nodding their heads? If I tell a personal story, people will sometimes say, oh, you know, you see them tilt their heads. Maybe they'll give me a warm smile. If I tell a bad joke, people will, out of pity, laugh. You know, it's all very validating when you have that kind of feedback. It means people are considering what you say. They don't have to agree with what you say, but they're considering you. But it's very strange when you're on Zoom, because you don't have that. You know, what you put out into the world will always make people respond to you, and you receive that response, and then that affects how you then respond back. And there's this feedback loop, which you don't really get with Zoom. There's not that validation as such, because right now, all I can see is myself. So for me, who has an inner critic who is constantly telling her that she's not good enough, it's quite difficult to sit here and just talk at a blank screen without that feedback. That means that I'm going to need a certain amount of confidence to talk. And so what I'm going to be speaking about is about confidence. Now, the dictionary definition of confidence is a feeling of self-assurance that arises from appreciation of one's own abilities or qualities. Okay, so that's what confidence is, dictionary definition. But does that mean that if I'm not confident, I'm not appreciating my abilities and capabilities? Am I not focusing on them? Am I focusing on my deficiencies, perhaps? Is it that inner critic telling me I'm not good enough? Does that mean I'm not confident? You see, for me, a confident person is someone who is fully connected to all aspects of their self, who has an awareness of both all of their abilities and capabilities and the things that their weaknesses. So, you know, that voice that you have in your head, okay? Because I'm going to speak about that inner critic, those things that you believe about yourself that are not good, those weaknesses. And you know that voice in your head that always tells you about them, that voice that tells you what you can't do, that tells you why you can't do it. I have that voice in my head for as long as I can remember, and I think, I'm guessing most of you do, everyone does. I can't tell because I can't see anyone nodding or shaking, but I'm going to be confident enough to say I think everyone has it. And the reason we have it is because we have this image of this ideal self that we want to be. And then we have this voice that tells us that why we won't be that person sometimes, not always. We'll work towards it, but sometimes it'll tell us why we can't be that person. And what we need to do is remind ourselves why we can be that person. So for me, for example, I will sit here and I can tell you I'm kind, I'm compassionate, I'm hardworking. I can tell you all the things that I want to achieve in life. But then I have this little voice, and sometimes it's quite a large voice, a loud voice, who tells me why I'm never going to achieve that. It'll remind me of all the times I've tried things and they didn't work out. It'll tell me about, well, it'll point out people who are trying to be the ideal that I want to be, compare me to them and say, look, you see, you're not as good. That inner voice always tells me who I'm not. And for me, a confident person is someone who knows both who they are and who they're not. For me, it's someone who knows that they're going to have their good days and bad days. They're going to have their good moments and bad moments. And that doesn't make them any less of a person. The trick is always going to be about finding the balance between those two narratives. Now, I think most of you have heard talks from attended these meetings before. You will have heard that we are all the story we tell ourselves in our head, right? So we narrate our lives all day long. When we wake up in the morning, we don't go into the bathroom and go, oh, sink, floor, ceiling. You don't do that. You say, oh, I'm going into the bathroom. I need to brush my teeth. I need to do my hair. You start narrating your life. That's how we make sense of our world. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, what we have to do, what we're going to do in the world. I know it's not just me. I know everybody does it. But we have two narratives that play out in our head. And I mean, often they've been depicted as the devil and the angel. And ideally, they run side by side with each other. We've got the narrative of who I am and the narrative of who I'm not. The problem is that we struggle in life when we focus on one narrative too much, focus too much on the I am, and there's a certain amount of arrogance that occurs. Focus too much on the I'm not, we're not confident. I'm going to be focusing more right now on these negative narrative identities, as I like to call them, because I think that's when we are really disconnected from ourselves, when we spend too much time in the I'm not world. Okay, so to give you an example of what I mean, a negative narrative identity for me is I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not slim enough. These are just mine. Feel free to add yours to the mix. I'm sure most of you will run a form of these negative narrative identities too. And again, I don't know if you're nodding or shaking your heads, feel free to add into the chat box whatever you want. Now, I worked with a young man a couple of years ago, and he was probably one of the smartest people I've ever worked with. And unbelievably, he was afraid that he wasn't smart enough. In fact, he was so entrenched in this belief that he failed his university degree, didn't go out to find a job, and stayed frozen in time on the couch for 10 years. Now, luckily, he met a girl who saw who he was, and she set him an ultimatum. She was like, look, I know you are amazing, but I need you to see it. I want you to go and sort yourself out, find a job, and if you do, we'll get married in the year. Otherwise, this is over. So he came to me. As he started to open up in therapy, it became really clear that all he could do was focus on who he wasn't. He had no clue who he was. He had this ideal self, which he pictured in his mind, this ideal self who knew everything about everything, had the dream job, the dream life, the dream car, the dream house. You know, everything was perfect. And it was good to have those ideals, even if some of them weren't necessarily achievable in the time frame he wanted. But the fact that he was so far away from that ideal, he took it personally, and that was it. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. So where did it come from? Well, he had one college course on something mathematical that was just beyond my pay grade, so I didn't really understand it. But he was telling me about it, and he took his final exam and he passed. He got 82%, which I think is an amazing grade. But the fact that he'd missed 18% made him lose his confidence, because he turned around to me and said, I can't do what I want to do. I need to be perfect. There is no room for error in maths. I can't go and do a job, and if I make a mistake, turn around and say, yeah, I failed that in my exam too. So he panicked. The next year when he went to do his final exam, he was so terrified of making a mistake, any more mistakes. When he sat down in that exam room to sit the exam, he froze. He didn't even answer a question. He got kicked out. He lost his university degree. He lost his dream. He fell so far behind that ideal self, he crumbled under the pressure and he froze. So I'm going to talk to you and talk you through how and why Jack fell victim to his thoughts, feelings, and neurobiology, because they're all linked. What Jack experienced is known as the fight or flight response. Okay, he froze. Now, we understand our world thanks to our five senses. Okay, all the information, we experience our world through our senses, and all that information is processed immediately in the brain. Now, there are three parts to your brain. You've got just here at the bottom, the reptilian brain, which we don't need to worry about right now. It deals with, your heart rate and temperature, things you don't need to think about, everything automatic. And then you've got your limbic system, and your limbic system is in the center of your brain, and it processes emotion, and it's really, really fast. That's because it takes a millisecond to feel something. So if I see a piece of chocolate cake in a moment, I'm in love. I'm very excited. Okay. So that's your limbic system. And then on top of it is the cortex. It's that crinkly part of the brain that we see photos of. And these two, well, the cortex deals with thought, and it takes longer to think about things than it does to feel things. So these two communicate with each other. All right. So if I see that piece of chocolate cake, I'm like, oh, I'm so excited. It's cake. And now I have to think, okay, but what am I going to do? Am I going to cut a piece of cake and have it now? Am I going to have a big piece, a small piece? Am I going to have a piece later? Okay, so feeling that feeling very, very quick. Thinking about what I'm going to do, planning my action, much, much slower. Now, the way the brain works is, if we see something, when we experience something and it's safe, these two parts of the brain, they communicate really, really well. But if there is something, let's say that's not a piece of cake, let's say that's a saber-toothed tiger that's coming towards me. There is a small structure in the limbic system called the amygdala, which is primed to sense threat. And what it does is it cross-references everything that you know about everything. And if it goes, oh, that's dangerous, these two parts of the brain, it's like they stop communicating. And you just come from a place of pure reaction, because the last thing you want to do is waste time thinking, does he look hungry? Because if you do, you'll be eaten. You need to either freeze and let the tiger walk past you, you need to fight, or you need to run away. So that's the fight or flight response. And we have it when we feel threatened. Problem is, our brain does not know the difference between psychological threat and physical threat. Both are the same. So for Jack, let's go back to Jack now. When he was sitting looking at that exam paper, his amygdala went crazy going, this is bad. This is bad. If you sit this exam and you do badly again, proof, you're an idiot. So he froze. He completely froze, and he has remained in that frozen state until he started to work on it. So why did Jack react like this? In psychology, we call it the negativity bias. See, life would be wonderful if we could walk around wearing the proverbial rose-tinted glasses, but we can't. We're primed to look for threat in the world, because when we do, that's how we stay safe. If we went out into the street without looking left or right or left, depending on where you are right now, that wouldn't be safe. You'd be hit by a car. You have to be responsible and look for danger in the world. That's how you protect yourself. But as I said, danger is not just physical, it's psychological, it's emotional. So when we're feeling a negative experience, when we're in fight or flight, it's because we're feeling threatened. We become hijacked by our emotions. I'm working with a couple at the moment. Every time the wife tells her husband something like, you didn't take the trash out last night, he flies into a rage. She doesn't understand it. She literally brought him to me and said, fix him or I'm leaving him. He's got a problem with not feeling good enough. When his wife says, you didn't do this, that makes him fly into a rage. He can't control it. He told me, I can't control it. So we worked on his self-esteem. Next thing you know, that fight or flight response has dampened down. He doesn't talk to himself so badly. That inner critic is more quiet now. If his wife tells him, you didn't take out the trash, it's not, ugh. He can think, he can rationalize. These two parts of the brain are talking to each other. I'm working with a mother and a daughter at the moment too. The daughter has a fear of not being lovable. She's the eldest of 4 siblings. Every time the mother brought a new baby into the house, the daughter felt she had to share more and more of her mother's love. She didn't really understand it. She didn't understand that her mother loved her as much, she just had less time. So every time she felt that she needed her mother's attention, or she saw one of her siblings getting attention, she would hit out at her siblings. Her mother would shout at her. Daughter goes nuts. Daughter starts screaming, shouting, throwing an absolute tantrum. Now the mother has had an abusive father, and she has a negative narrative identity of I'm not safe. So when her daughter was behaving like that, she'd step away, she'd leave her, she'd run. She's a runner, she's a flyer. That's her fight or flight response. The daughter interpreted that as my mother doesn't love me. So that feedback loop that I was talking about before, what the daughter was putting out into the world was coming back to her, just proving to her that she's not lovable again. And she was putting it out, and they ended up in this horrible vicious cycle. The daughter started self-harming. Both the mother and daughter started to do some work on their negative narrative identities of I'm not safe, I'm not lovable. They started to understand themselves. Now, I'm going to come around to the inner critic now, okay? Think about the people you've got difficult relationships with. Think about those things that you tell yourself. Think about the times when, let's go back to Jack, okay? I asked him, what is he good at? He struggled. He didn't know how to tell me. When I asked him what he wasn't good at, he reeled off a whole list of things. You see, when we lose our confidence, we disconnect from who we are. We focus on everything but our abilities and capabilities. He was constantly telling himself that he couldn't go out into the world and do anything good. And anytime he was given an opportunity, he would freeze. He didn't even understand why. We're designed to worry about who we are in the world. We're social creatures. We're meant to care what other people think. He didn't want people to see him as a fool, his word, not mine. He didn't want people to think he wasn't smart. So he froze and he stayed in his house, didn't put himself out there because he kept telling himself, you can't do it. You're not good enough to do the job you want to do. You're not good enough to work in the way that you want to work. He was so worried about being incompetent. He hung back. So this is positive psychology. Let's talk about how we fight this, okay? How do we manage ourselves so that we're not in I'm not world? How do we manage ourselves so that our fight or flight response doesn't get triggered by the feelings and the beliefs that we have of I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, I'm not safe? Because that's the narratives which trigger us and stop us from living the lives we want to live. When Brené Brown started her research, it was focused on connection. And she said that connection is about being seen, heard, and valued in life. And from the work that I've done with my clients, I've seen it's also about accepting oneself. So that's the model that I'm going to talk you through, okay? If you want to manage your inner critic so that you don't only live in the I'm not world, because that's what your inner critic does, is it tells you what you aren't, and you want to be able to know who you are while managing who you're not. The first thing you need to do is see who you are. Visibility. And then put that person out into the world. Again, I'm going to talk you through a client so that this makes more sense. I have a client that I'm going to call Mark, and he was referred to me recently because he tried to take his own life. He's 18, he's in his final year of high school. He's incredibly kind and sensitive and very wise, but he didn't see himself as such. When I asked him to describe himself, he told me, I'm slow, I'm not academic. And then he said, I can't live up to my parents' expectations, the ideal that they're setting up for him. He told me, all I do all day long is I have this voice in my head telling me how useless I am. When I asked him what he was good at, he said, not many things. I don't have things like my friends. I've got one friend who's good at guitar, another one who's good at dance. What he was doing was he was setting up this ideal that everybody else based on everybody else's abilities. So his parents had this ideal of he needs to be academic, he needs to be a straight A student, and he couldn't live up to it. So his inner critic started going crazy. You're not smart, okay? This is who you're meant to be. You're not smart. He had his friend's ideal, which was all about, musical accomplishment and things that you could see. And it was, look, you're not special. When I asked him about being special, he said, well, my mother once told me that one day I will find the thing that I'm special at. And I do believe her, but I keep looking and I can't find it. I've tried everything. And what he did was he started looking outside in the world for things. But every time he tried something new, his inner critic told him, look, this is not for you. You're useless. You can't do it. And so again, he started to freeze and then wanted to run away from his life. Hence, he tried to take his own life. What Mark didn't do was look inside of himself and see what was already there. That was already amazing. Something to build off of for his ideal. I already said it, Mark's wise. He has the most incredible emotional intelligence. Now, these are not things which are really measured at his age. He can spot behavioral patterns in his friends. He can tell you this one's this, and that's probably because of this and this and this. He's very, very smart. When I pointed this out to him, he said, that's not special. And I'm like, well, how many of your friends are able to think in the way you do? He's like, well, not many. That's why they come to me when they're struggling. I said, okay, so that's quite special. He said, no, it's just ordinary. Mark doesn't see the extraordinary in his ordinary. He's so focused on who he's not looking at who he is. And the ideal that he's trying to live up to doesn't match with who he is. He's taking his gifts for granted. My daughter is an amazing mathematician, okay? I'll look at her and say, wow, you're amazing. She's like, no, I'm not. It's easy. Okay, for you. Again, she doesn't see the extraordinary in her ordinary. It's like if there's no pain, no gain, then it's not special. Sometimes we're closer to our ideal self than we realize, but we need to base that ideal on the things that we're capable of achieving. We need to see who we are, recognize our strengths, and then also be aware of our weaknesses and use those weaknesses to help us become stronger, but without overplaying and only focusing on them. In our last session, this was only last week, Mark told me, I'm starting to see who I am. I think I know what you mean. I was speaking to a friend who's struggling, and I see what you mean. I think I'm actually quite good at talking to people and understanding people in a way that some of my friends don't. I still have that voice in my head that tells me I'm not smart, but I also have that voice that tells me, but that's okay because I'm people smart. He's starting to recognize the two narratives. He's aware of both. He said, when I sit in class, I know that I'm going to have a hard time, but that's okay. If I work hard, I'll do my best, and that I know now that has to be enough. If you spend too much time thinking who you're not, you suffer with who you are, you suffer with narcissism. Too much time in the I'm not, self-doubt. You need to balance the two just in the way that Mark does. So one of my favorite moments in therapy is when that's what my clients start to do. They start to work with both narratives hand in hand. Mark last month started speaking up for himself, putting his hand up in class. A friend said something, he answered them, and people are starting to respond differently to him. What he's putting out into the world, he's making himself visible. The only thing is he's still a little bit not listening to himself. He's not really speaking up to his parents yet. That's because he doesn't recognize, well, he recognizes that he needs to, but he's scared. He's scared. There's a difference between needs and desires. He tells me, oh, I want their approval. I want them to see me for who I am. I don't need it, but he does. It comes up all the time. Sometimes we need to recognize the difference between our needs and our wants, okay? So he needs to listen to himself and voice out loud his needs, his wants, and have them in line with who he is and who he's not. That's the next step, right? Being heard. He might not be academic, doesn't mean he's not good enough. He will never be a straight A student, he tells me, but that doesn't matter. He's still allowed to tell people, I don't want to be a mathematician or an academic. I want to be a this or a that, and that will make him good enough. The world needs people, all types of different people. We don't just want academics for our kids. We need people who coming up into the world who are good at gardening, people who are good at dance. You know, sitting and judging yourself or allowing our kids to judge themselves by others' measures doesn't work. Yeah, knowing what you're not good at can help you strive harder. Knowing who you want to be keeps you motivated, but make sure it's in line with who you are. And so that comes to the point of acceptance, accepting that person, and then valuing the extraordinary of your ordinary. When something comes naturally to us, it's so easy to ignore that strength, that quality, that incredible part of ourselves. Mark will stand up for himself now if someone pushes him down, but he won't do that with his inner critic yet. If his inner critic is really attacking him, he gives in and he says, you know what, I'm not good enough. You're right, I'm right. No, you might not be as good as you want to be, but it doesn't mean you're not good enough. He needs to start valuing the goodness that he is when it comes to his academic achievement. He needs to value who he is in totality. Everyone has their own magic. Mark, me, you, all of you. Now, someone once asked me, how do you identify your I'm not if you don't know what it is? My experience is if you sit for long enough in silence, you start to become aware. I think that's what this pandemic has shown us. Now, if we're talking to ourselves all day long, how many of you are nice to yourself all the time? I doubt anyone is nice to themselves all the time because of the negativity bias. And in the past year, my therapy business exploded because the world went quiet, which meant there was no noise, no distraction. People started to drive themselves mad with who they aren't. You need to challenge that inner critic when you can. It's everything I've just been speaking about. Or silence the voice for a while. You know, I think that's why meditation makes such a difference to people. Through meditation, you learn to not pay attention to the I'm not. You learn to manage your thoughts and not question them and just let them go. Sitting in silence is a really powerful tool. It helps us to identify the I am and the I am not. Next thing you could do is you can think about the things that people say that trigger you. I had a client who told me her husband bullies her. She said, he always tells me that I know nothing, okay? I said, okay, do you believe him? She said, well, no. Okay, so how do you respond? She said, I get angry. I'm like, okay. So you get annoyed? She said, yeah. Well, I said, okay. If I told you you have crazy purple hair, what would you say? She's like, oh, that was just ridiculous. I don't. I said, okay. So you know it's not true. She's like, yeah. I said, does it annoy you? She's like, no. I said, okay. Why does it annoy you that your husband tells you that you know nothing? And that was her aha moment. She's like, yeah, because a part of me worries that maybe he's right. Okay, think about the things that people say that trigger you to help you work out what your negative narrative identity is. The next thing I think is question yourself, to what extent does that identity control me, or do I have control over it? As I said, I'm not, they serve a purpose. We need them there. They keep us safe. They protect us. They help us to become stronger. They help us to show our weaknesses so we can work on them. We don't want to get rid of them. We just don't want them to control us. We don't want them to cause us emotional pain. So manage them by self-compassion. Think about the things that you say. What would your best friend tell you if you were to tell her these horrible thoughts that sometimes you have about yourself? Another thing that we can do is journaling. Now, there's a few reasons why I think journaling helps, but one is that when we have bad thoughts about ourselves, we sometimes when we think, we think at about 650 words per minute, and we can spiral out of control at that kind of rate. When we type, it's about 60 words a minute. We write even slower. So already journaling slows down our thought process. That's a good way to already calm our thoughts down. Then after that, look at what's written. Means test what you've written. Look for the evidence for and against. See if the horrible things you tell yourself are all true. Or seek the help of a professional. Don't use any unhealthy coping mechanisms, or become aware if you are. That's how we manage triggers. Some people manage triggers through, overworking, over exercising, substance abuse. We can't control our biology, but you can work on the triggers. You can work on managing that voice in your head without getting rid of it, because we need it, but enough to keep that fight or flight reaction, dampening it down so that it's less prevalent in our lives, so that it doesn't rule us. That's how you live a better life. Recognizing who you are as well as who you're not. Accepting that person, valuing that person, and allowing yourself to know that you're the best version of you that you can be. Over to you, Caroline. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was very, very informative and I think helpful. We've gotten a bunch of comments in the chat that I want to just give you a moment to look into, but also just let's start with what does she mean by a trance state? I don't know if, which you actually have been talking about. When we're listening to the inner critic too much and we're not able to hear, that is like a trance state, correct?
It's an altered state of consciousness. So it's when you're not completely in control. So a trance state would be a state of anxiety, a state of when you are overly doubting yourself, so that creates your anxiety. Or if you're very, very sad, depression, we would see as a trance state. It's quite a big question, but there are people who are sometimes smoking without even realizing it, or how people say, I was eating something, I didn't even realize I was eating it. For us, we look at these as trance states. So they're altered states of consciousness when you're not fully in control of yourself.
It sort of reminds me of my assistant recently got engaged to be married. And, I noticed that in that sort of love state, the problems or any of the challenges seem to just be much easier to handle, right?
Absolutely.
And I remind myself of, when I'm in a gratitude state, which is why I think gratitude is so important. It elevates mood, right? And when I'm in that kind of state, I can handle the problems in a different way. Can you comment on that? Because you have done a lot of writing on gratitude as well.
Yeah, so gratitude is where you start to look for, even if you're, the particular piece which I think you're referring to is that in my own life experience, caring for an ill husband and working with people with Parkinson's, there is that the way that a lot of caregivers manage their lives and manage the sadness that sometimes comes with having an ill loved one is by looking for the good in the world. So there is so much I'm not that comes with caregiving. I'm not able to help my loved one, so I'm not good enough. I can't be the person that they need me to be to make everything better. So there's a lot of caregiver guilt, and in that way, a lot of people that I've worked with, and myself included, we found that having gratitude for what we can, looking for things that we can be grateful for, that makes a difference. It helps you to manage the I'm not, I don't have. It makes you focus on what you do have in life.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Christine says, it also sounds a lot like cognitive distortion or catastrophizing when you were talking about your client. Yeah. And then Bunny gave a wonderful example. She said, I used to run like races that included marathons. I found out that I was fairly good runner and winning in my age group. And that gave me such confidence. I realized that I was really not that bad. And it seems to me like we can use sometimes our actions as evidence to prove that our ordinary is extraordinary.
Absolutely. And that's really what you want to be looking for in life, right? Is looking for your extraordinary. And it can be little things. It can be something amazing like Bunny's experienced, but it can be something small, you know. Sometimes I've had people come to me and say, I know I'm just not a good person. And it's like, you, I doubt that you're never a good person. You know, give me a time when someone smiled at you and they're like, oh, well, I bought a paper off the homeless guy and he smiled at me and I gave him a smile back. I'm like, okay, that's magical. You saw that person. How many other people walked past that person that day? He's like, yeah, nobody else stopped when I was there. Like, yeah, exactly. Extraordinary in your ordinary. You are kind. You're a good person. Everyone has moments where they're good and when they're less good, let's say.
But you know what? It reminds me of something that is said in coaching, which is it is the question that we ask that can activate the person or shift the state. So even that question, and I ask everybody in the chat, when did somebody last smile at you? Now, of course, we have masks on, so it might be a little bit hard to tell, but you have the little crinkles in the eyes to look at that. I mean, that's an extraordinary question to ask because it takes the client or the person that you're discussing with a moment to reflect and say, hey, wait a minute, people have smiled at me. And then the perspective changes and can shift almost on a dime, right?
Absolutely. And then there is that whole thing of what you put out into the world comes back at you. Okay, when that person smiled at you, did you instigate the smile or did they instigate the smile? Because if it came from them, that's one thing, but also you're capable of instigating a smile as well. Don't forget that you have more control than you think in the world. And sometimes you need to be a little bit more proactive.
Beautiful. We have a couple of things I want to share with you in the chat. Oriana says, I recently saw a quote along these lines. We judge our insides by comparing ourselves with other people's outsides. Right. And we tend to look at the achievements of others before looking into our own selves. Not uncommon, I think. Marcia says what Suzette is saying, it seems, is like when frustration with not accomplishing sets in, a person's self-doubt increases and negative thoughts and feelings increase. Seems like when positive thoughts increase, our self-worth increases. Would you say that that's true?
I think that's very often the case. Not always. I mean, I've had people who are incredibly successful who still come to me and say, yeah, but they're very easy at palming it off and saying, yeah, I'm successful and I've done really well, but it's not because of me. It depends on how we make sense of what's going on in our lives, whether we personalize it or not. You know, Marty Seligman, he talks about, I can't remember the term. It's, do you know what I'm talking about, Caroline? It's the explanatory styles. So
okay.
when we explain something to ourselves as I have instigated this, it becomes personal. It's thanks to me. But if someone attributes their success to something else, then no, then even if they're receiving accolades and whatever, it's not enough.
That's an important distinction. That's an important distinction. Ellen also said, not sure what the inner critic has to do with the fight or flight response to danger. Is it more that confidence mitigates the fight or flight response?
Yes, I think the thing is when you have an inner critic who is very, very loud or very attuned to threat. So let's say, for example, I used to be terrified that I'm not good enough. That was my greatest thing, is I'm not good enough. And I would never speak publicly. I mean, I would never put my hand up in class as a child in school. I was terrified of speaking up. Because I've always felt that I wasn't good enough. And if someone spoke to me or called me out, I'd go bright red. I'd want to run away. I just wanted the world to swallow me up. So that was my fight or flight response. And what I needed to do is tone down that inner critic, that fear of not being good enough. The moment you tone it down, it's like lowering the volume on it. And this can be unconscious. It doesn't have to be that you're fully consciously aware of that, always that inner critic, but it's when you tone it down and you make it less attuned to that level of threat, then your fight or flight response, my experience has been with my clients, is that they are less reactive. I hope, Ellen, that helps answer your question.
Yeah. I also would love to talk about this these two narratives, right, that are happening, and how they are absolutely normal. And it's not about having one or the other. I thought it was fascinating what you said about narcissism or self-doubt, right? And that it really is like sailing. We need to tack back and forth, right?
Exactly.
And that realistically, we're going to go one way and then we kind of self-correct. And we almost need both to keep us in balance. But we were talking earlier about that's sort of complex. And as our brain doesn't kind of like to admit that our existence is more complex, right? We hear a lot about black and white thinking. And it seems like your client, Mark, it was like all or nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it will always be contextual. So there will be some people who, so I had one client who was absolutely fine speaking to his peers at work, but the second you put him with management, he was like, I can't talk. Okay, so that's that. It's not binary. It's not this or that. That's the gray in the middle of I can speak to these people, I just can't speak to these people. And yeah, that's that complexity of everything is contextual. It isn't black and white. There are going to be some people where we're able to navigate between those two narratives quite easily, and certain situations where we just don't. We will veer more to one or veer more to the other. You know, with my children when they were growing up, I was definitely much more of the no, I know best. No matter what they said. But now, as they are older, I doubt myself a lot more because they're much mouthier.
You know, I had a brain mentor and she said, it is wise to be suspicious of your brain, right? It is wise to be suspicious of what you are thinking and even of what you're feeling. She once asked me, do you believe everything you think is true? Or do you know, she just said, do you believe everything you think? Do you believe everything you feel? And that was amazing. That was an amazing question.
It is a good question, isn't it? Because I guess the fact that it's inside of us, we automatically think, well, it must be true, right? Well, otherwise, why are we thinking? Why are we making up stories? There's enough fake news out there in the world. I don't need it living inside of my head. But we do. We all create these stories about ourselves that we're never going to do this and we're never going to do that. We do. Of course we do. And we'll look for evidence of why we're not good enough and why we're not going to cope and why we're not going to do. It's what we do. It's how we prepare ourselves for the worst.
Right. So it's actually normal. But let's talk about, like, in positive psychology, we talk about the ideal self and working on that. Do you have clients at all where you have them look at a scenario in which they were successful so they can look at some of their strengths? I know that has been used often.
Absolutely, absolutely. There are some clients who I will sit there and we will do some strengths work and strengths, knowing your strengths, knowing your character strengths and knowing your abilities, capabilities, knowing your values. All of these things will tie into your ideal self. It is that much easier to identify, but there are some people who are so entrenched in the ideals that have been passed down to them, either by their parents, their schools, their peers, their cultures, that they will veer away and they'll go, yes, okay, yes, that was me on a good day, but and then comes in this magical but, which kind of goes and destroys all the good work. And it's like, no. Let's bring you back to who are you at your best, right? That's something that we ask in positive psychology. Who are you at your best? But you have to be accepting. That's the whole thing of accepting and valuing. You need to accept that your best is not the same as everybody else's best. You need to value that best. That's the point. Accept that best and value that best. Very, very important, not to judge yourself by everyone else's standards.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the value of the and.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And both of us have are fans of Maria Serwa, right?
Yeah,
And I know you've worked with her and brought her over, and that yes, and what is also true,
exactly.
right? So making sure that it's almost validating the negative uh, inner critic, isn't it? It's like we can't push it away and say, oh, that's not important, or I'm only going to think positive. We have to say, yes, you exist, and resilience is in the middle, the ability to hold both and then focus on what is possible.
Absolutely. It's that thing of, I can be not very good at this and still be good at this. I can be this and this. I can be, I'm not this and I am this. It's that magical and that she speaks about 100%. It's accepting both sides of that equation. I am not this and I am that. It's
beautiful. Denise asked a great question. What if your fear, if you speak up and then, it's validated because you're rejected and your fear comes true?
I love that question. Thank you very much, Denise. Okay, so this is another thing which I didn't necessarily state. We all have this desperate need to be wanted, needed, loved. Yes. And so when we go and we are afraid of speaking up, it's because we want people to accept what we say. And if they don't accept what they say, then we feel rejected. Not everybody is going to accept you, and that's okay. And it's not because you're not good enough. It might be that these are not your people. It might be that what you've said in this context is not right, but it doesn't mean that you're not smart enough. It's not because you've had one particular experience which didn't go well, does it create an identity of, you know what, you're right, I'm not smart enough to do this, I'm not good enough to do this, I'm not part of this group. No, it's never be afraid to speak up if there's something that you believe in. Now, the people who are your people, either they will gently and kindly tell you, hun, have you thought about this? At which point you can go, oh, okay. And you become wiser and you become smarter thanks to the shared collective wisdom of others. Or people reject you, at which point you go, do you know what? These are not my people. I'm going to find people who are my people. Because at the end of the day, do you like everybody in the world? Come on, nobody does. I don't like everyone. So it's unrealistic to think that everyone is going to like me or you or anyone. So you need to find your people in life, and that's okay.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful example. And Jill says, I find I make more headway when I look back to when and how these aspects, these narrative first developed and what they might need. Example, my inner critic is hypervigilant for threat. If I begin to develop inner resources around self-support for safety, that narrative is soothed and quieted. Can you comment on that?
So it's funny because automatically with my therapist head on is if you feel the need for safety, it suggests that there is a fear around not being safe. And so is that an issue that you are aware of, or am I jumping to a conclusion here right now?
We could ask Jill to unmute if you like.
Yeah, I think so. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. Jill, do you want to unmute?
Sure. Thanks so much for taking my question. I'm very much aware of that question for myself and that need and issue in my life.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that you're trying to soothe that fear of not being safe in the world, right?
I am trying to work with that. I recognize that safety in the world doesn't really exist. I can't just automatically say this is a safe world and therefore here I go out into it. However, I recognize from a very early age that issue has been with me. And so I am trying to work with the narrative and the aspect of me that still feels wherever I turn, that's the primary issue that comes up for me. So rather than, and it plays out then for myself in terms of, oh, I'm less than. I'm less than, I'm not good enough, I'm broken, that sort of thing. And so rather than intellectually approach, I recognize I have a number of strengths. So rather than just approach it from an intellectual perspective of like, well, I've got all these strengths, so just never mind that piece because it continues to show up. I'd rather support the part that shows up every day with, is it safe? Is it safe? Is it safe? And try to support myself in saying, it's safe now. Wasn't then, it's safe now, that sort of thing.
Okay, so that in itself is fantastic that you're starting to already dampen down by saying it's safe now. It suggests that you've got slightly more control over the narrative that was more controlling. Am I right?
Yes, that is correct. Thank you.
Fantastic. So that's exactly what I'm talking about, is every now and then we will have a narrative which will control us. And it's always going to be about finding the mechanisms which are right for you, which are going to help you to manage them in the way that you're doing. And the more you learn how to manage it, hopefully you would hope that you feel more safe in the world. There is a chance that there will be triggers every now and then, but you just want to dampen them down less and less and less.
Thank you so much.
Not at all, Han. Well done for coming up and speaking. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Beautiful. So we have, even on Zoom chat, you can feel invisible when your comments aren't acknowledged. Oh, Lisa, I'm sorry that you feel that way. I am trying to get to everyone. Let me see where, Lisa said, the only people who don't have problems are the people you don't know very well. That is true.
I love that.
Maria S. Sarwa did an exercise where we listed our negative traits and then our positive traits, said Ellen. And Jennifer said, this seems like it's about learned optimism. Can you comment about that?
Yes, I guess it is. There is that, it is very much, look, at the end of the day, we are all going to be talking about, every psychologist, therapist, mental health worker, we're looking at how do we dampen down our triggers and manage ourselves. And so, yes, 100% is about learned optimism.
Yes. And then Nancy shared that Taming Your Inner Gremlin is a great book. And then let's see, there was one question. I want to make sure I get everyone. Sorry. Pray about the couple with the garbage problem. Dara wants to know, don't you think the woman was rather passive aggressive and needed some help too?
Remember, I'm giving you a very small snapshot of what went
Yes.
on in a whole experience. They had some other things that were going on in their marriage. So yes, there were some other issues that she had her issue about not being heard enough. And so, yes, well
Yeah.
spotted.
Also wanted to just talk a little bit more with you about this idea of these two narratives. I know that we have a program next week with the Handel group, and they're going to be talking about something called taglines. And it seems like it's similar to what you're talking about, which is that you like have a tagline, which is I'm not good enough. And then you look at that and then you actually replace it with another tagline, which is, I try my best, and that's good enough. Right. And so it's a free program, everyone. I put it in the chat if you're interested in looking at that.
I think there's always going to be, because we're all different, there's never going to be one way of working which is going to help everybody. Everyone needs to find the thing which is going to help them to manage this inner critic, to help you to manage these two narratives. I like that. I like the idea of the tagline. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, I think it's important to just recognize that this isn't going to go away, right? Managing our inner critic and also the potential for arrogance on the other side is a human challenge. And that to do so, to recognize that there's not a single person on the planet that doesn't have to do that. It's part of growing up in a way. That we're fully developing into our full self, right? And yeah, go ahead.
That's when we recognize it. If you can recognize it in yourself, and then you can recognize it in others. That's the next step, right? Recognize it in others. When you see someone who is running away or fighting, or recognize that that's what's going on for them too. It's not just for you. Everyone has this. So if you've got a relationship, a dynamic which is difficult, think about what is it that you say that triggers that person. Think about what is it that they say that triggers you. Because the more you're aware, the kinder you can be, the more you bring compassion into that relationship, the more you'll dampen down these extreme reactions. Well, sometimes they can be extreme, sometimes not so extreme, depends. But the more you can manage that.
And another reason why that is important is once we're triggered and we have activated that limbic, amygdala response, we have to take the time to calm that all down.
100%. Remember, you've got your limbic system in the cortex. If you're in fight or flight, they are not communicating. So particularly I have this with parents who are like, she's not listening, she's not understanding. I'm like, of course she's not understanding. Her brain's not communicating.
What I love about it is Daniel Siegel's thing is like, she's flipped her lid.
That's exactly it. Give the kid a chance. Let them calm down. Give your partner a chance. Give your friend a chance. Give yourself a moment to just calm down. You're right. They're not thinking. They're not speaking rationally. They won't. Calm down.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I just want to end with that idea of this is very human, that we all flip our lid, that we then want to self-soothe. We had a workshop on that last one, a positive psychology hour about that self-compassion, bringing in that compassion, which actually helps to mitigate the cortisol and the full rush of that. And then how about a sense of humor, right?
Absolutely.
Lightening up, that this happens to everybody, that it is giving ourselves a break and sort of looking at the ways that we do it rather than hiding and pretending. I can't help but feel that Mark, maybe he didn't tell anybody for so long, those 10 years to be frozen. That's a long time.
It is, but he's moving on.
Yeah. And to really reach out and ask for help, wouldn't you say, to someone like yourself? Yeah.
That's
to not sit in that inner critic.
100%.
When do we know that we should ask for help? Let's finish with that. When we're being frozen,
recognize, to what extent are you being controlled by the fight or flight response? To what extent are you miserable because of the thoughts in your head? If this is really controlling you, if this is really affecting your mental health, reach out, ask someone for help. There are so many therapists out there. There are some wonderful people. Reach out, ask for help.
Thank you so much, Suzette. It's been a pleasure. It really has. And I'm going to put some information in the chat, everybody. We have, of course, some people have been asking about our, we're doing a couples massage and cooking for the heart and soul this week. And in honor of the Day of the Heart, which is on Sunday. That should be fun. It's going to be on Zoom. I don't know exactly how we're doing that, but we're going to. The therapist that's teaching massage techniques is amazing. And the person that's cooking, she wrote this wonderful book called Vegetables for Breakfast. And so it's going to be very healthy, but a little bit decadent, which should be really fun too. And then I just wanted to let everybody know what we're doing on Thursday. We're going to be talking with Boreana about expanding our capacity for love. I'll put that in the chat, which is a way of also mitigating our inner critic. And then finally, if anybody's around tomorrow, we have a free conference on heart health. We're going to be, I'm going to be interviewing the Esselstyn family, and they have had a way of working and eating to reverse heart disease, which is the #1 killer. So lots of things to do. I would love to, I'm going to take the spotlights off, and I would love for everybody to just thank Suzette. We can have you go into gallery view. You can all unmute and just thank and say hi to everybody.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I
agree. Everybody should have a Suzette, someone said in the chat. And I think that that's true.
And a Caroline.
Oh, thank you. I'll take that in.
What was the name of that? What was the name of the place where you did the certificate, the positive psychology?
Oh, that is the Whole-Being Institute, and I can you can get $100 off, and we have a giving circle. I'll put that in the chat as well. Thank you for asking about that.
Wonderful course. Wonderful.
Yes, yes. Both Suzette and I have graduated from that program, as have many of the people on this call. And it's 9 months, so I cannot think of a better way to spend the next 9 months than in the company of positive people with educators that are extraordinary. Extraordinary.
Thank you so much. This was really terrific. Bye,
Very
Suzette.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank you,
Caroline.
Suzette.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzette.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye now.